other reflections on the War of the Functions or potential implications of that for education, for political organization, for religious leadership, for whatever. Yeah, Jackie.
Well, just sitting here and hearing you articulate what you just have, I find so exciting and hopeful, because I was reflecting last night on some of Von France's work, and the way that she talks about, if you can look at the dream, and then you can find the mythology that correlates with that dream, that the component that's needed for healing can be found at the core, the archetypal core
of the story.
Right. And that if one, first it has to be an intellectual understanding, and then one needs the cooperation. You can't, maybe you could do this by yourself, but it would be very difficult. But the mentoring process, if one can somehow integrate that and then somehow put it into action, or discover what kind of action is necessary on an individual level and cultural level, that there's a possibility for healing to take place. And what I think, this may be projection on my part, forgive me if it is, but what I think I hear you saying is something very similar to that. Is that you're saying when you look into these, into the correlation of these mythologies throughout our history, into antiquity, and bringing it forward in time now, there's a possibility of following this formula, if you will, and applying it.
Right. Yeah, I think that, Jungians have always had this sense of the importance of amplification of dream materials with other cultural materials like folklore, myths, spiritual traditions and images and so on. And they've just sort of intuited that that's helpful, that you need to, that there's something in there for you. That is, it pays to study Grimm's fairy tales. Jungians always, if you get an image in a dream, it's like the handless maiden. If you dream that something's wrong with your hands, you read the handless maiden and work with that. But I think what you're picking up is really right. It's what I am suggesting, and I, to me, it's not just some sort of hocus pocus. I mean, I think this is really something that can be really examined, researched. In fact, I have a lot more confidence now that there's material that's relevant for this that's available now. It's already available. All these scholars have been doing this stuff. They just haven't been... See, data doesn't interpret itself. You have to bring questions to data. You have to bring a theory to data. You have to bring questions to data, or the data doesn't speak. It's just gibberish. And but I actually think that there's a real possibility that we may get more evidence supporting the Jungian insight that there may be dynamic wisdom in these ancient stories, that's not just a Jungian romance or sort of a romantic idea. If you begin to meditate on how old, I mean, think about, Bill, have you ever seen any estimates on how far back that proto-Indo-European culture may in fact reach? Because now we're talking about before Roman. We're talking about before the Vedas.
The first wave of the incursions archaeologically has been dated between 4,300 and 4,000 BC. And there have been horse remains found in the steppes, at least that old, indicating that they were being ridden at least 4,000 years ago. So that's consistent. The horses were being ridden before the wheels invented, before the chariot. So those two things are consistent with that wave coming in about 4,000 BC. There was another wave about 1,000 years later, and a third wave about 2,800.
Yeah. So these traditions are extremely old, and if you don't have a kind of a modernist bias, which assumes that modern people have more wisdom about human life than ancient people, if you don't buy that, then you can at least entertain the possibility that in these teaching stories and these narratives, and of course Grimm's fairy tales go back to this ancient literature behind them. I mean, that's been pretty widely accepted. It's entirely possible that careful scrutiny of these literatures, particularly on these issues of how do you transgress with your aggression. See, this Indo-European literature's got a lot of discussion about what is misuse of aggression that can have dynamic implications. What is misuse of what is bribery? I mean, boy, if that's not timely, I don't know what is. You know, the buying of the elections. Can you imagine thinking about the selling of the government of the United States and think about that as the golden bribe in a flagrant form? So I think that I felt this for some time, but I've never been as convinced that Jungian approaches to mythology as sources for data on the way the psyche really operates. I've never been as sure that that's a promising line of research. It's just we just have to do it. You know, the problem today is that fewer and fewer people in the Jungian community are doing serious research into archetypal materials. You know, they tend to get over-impressed by Kleinian theories, or they get over-impressed by other British object relations theories, or they get over-impressed by this Freudian tradition or that Freudian tradition, none of which have any relevance for this kind of work. Yes.
Avenues for further research.
Yes, let's touch on what needs to be researched. Yes.
We seem to be stuck in the Dumezil mode, which is
In the what?
in the Dumezil mode.
Okay. Yes. We are indeed, as a series of universities, stuck in the Doniger mode.
And we tend not to look at how many diverse things fit patterns. I was sitting here thinking that there are many myths. There are also films. I think of The Wizard of Oz fitting into that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the way that one learns to win a chess game and how the back row of the chess room has Dumezil's system. The royals, the bishops, the knights, the rooks, or the home utility. I mean, there's a number of connections.
See, now that's what I got. My first insights into this fourfoldness was from looking at the chessboard and and playing cards and these other. I began to realize that. So I continue with your thought. I agree with you that there are enormous reflections of the structure.
And no one piece will win the game.
No one piece will win.
You've got to manipulate all of them, or you're going to lose. Some research that I have no idea how you would do it, what kind of, but it would be interesting to take a group of young people and teach them the myths and the stories and so forth over an extended period. That would be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Helping them see these underlying patterns and even how they relate to dreams and tarot cards, and or the large spectrum of things that are typically ignored in academic settings, and to see if instead of marketable skills being measured at the beginning and the ending of one's education, seeing if teaching these underlying patterns does in fact somehow lead to a better adjusted or a more well-balanced set of human beings.
Right.
Give them some sort of a therapeutic testing tool at the beginning and one at the end.
Yes.
And just expose them to these myths, help them see the underlying patterns, and see if they are capable at that point of drawing conclusions about their own lives. And that seems much more useful to me than teaching them
how to claw their way to the top of it. Yeah.
Right. Or he's saying that it would be very interesting to think about what role in a mentoring process toward maturation might be played by teaching these kinds of materials about these myths and the moral reflections in these myths about human life and so on, and having it involved in a mentoring process of development, and see if it does in fact lead to empowered young people, or we would say initiated young people. There are people doing this now. I mean, it's not being done in the educational institutions. I know that in African American culture, African teaching stories are being used like this to help young African American men and women move toward maturation. I know that in a lot of other sectors, these stories are being used in this way, but not in a nearly as systematic way that you're talking about. I know that Michael Meade has done a lot with using stories to try to vision maturation processes. His book, Men in the Waters of Life, is an example. So I think that is very interesting, and that would be what we would call formation, or a real educational process toward maturation, which our contemporary educational system steers clear of any concepts of maturation, because you would have to believe in the humanities, you'd have to believe in the human, you'd have to believe there was such a thing as the human. And in our universities today, there's enormous resistance to the idea that there is the human.
Serving the ruler by providing it with workers.
Right. Or we could say, for example, on your IBM example, he also made a comment about preparing the person to lead the corporation, for example. We could also shift that another way. We could say that it's ultimately in the interest of corporations to have leaders who have a healthy integration of sovereignty issues, sovereignty values. For example, if international corporations rape the earth enough, they're not going to have any habitat to make profits in. In the United States today, we've got all these folks that have enormous economic and political power that think all trees are alike. I have people look me right in the eye and they say, "Don't you know there are more trees now than there have ever been before?" And you know what they mean by that? Christmas trees. Farming of Christmas trees. Everybody is planting and farming all these but they have no sense whatsoever about the rainforest and what happens to the earth if the rainforest continues to be destroyed. But these are folks that are otherwise fairly smart, and they will look me in the eye and they'll tell me that. There are more trees now than ever before. Well, there's an interest on the part of business. Businessmen have a legitimate interest in the environment. They just don't realize it. Except, let us say, many of them don't. There are many really fine business leaders who have a sense of the public and of their public responsibilities. So the issue, I would say it another way, I'd say, or we could say to these business schools, don't you realize that you have an obligation to be providing leaders for international business who have a clue about responsibility to planetary civilization? It's uncanny that contemporary business schools at the, quote, greatest universities don't teach that stuff at all. They don't care about it. David White? Yeah. David White's going into corporations and teaching some of this, and I have a number of friends who are, my friend John Franklin, who is a consultant working with with a number of major corporations, who is seeking to help them think about their corporate responsibilities. And there are a lot of people doing that now. So there's some hope on that front too. I mean, it's not that we don't want the corporate people to get a good education. What is a good education? A good education would be something that would at least have a sense of the limitation of power, stewardship of power, balancing of these kinds of energies for the building of a cosmos, of a habitat for humanity and friends. So I think that with Jackie here, I think that I think there's probably a lot of moral wisdom in those tales, and certainly psychological wisdom, and that's just a research task. What I was saying was that it's gotten increasingly difficult to pursue that kind of research. You know, you can learn, it's easier to learn to be a competent Adlerian therapist or a competent Freudian therapist than it is to become a competent Jungian therapist. Because if you really take archetypal material seriously, you have to study archetypal materials, right? And what I'm saying this weekend is we're really fortunate in that there's this huge body of research that's already been done, that Jungian scholars who really believe that there is an archetypal self and that there is an objective psyche and that there is a collective unconscious, we can go over that research with a fine-tooth comb and see what we find. That's going to be fun. Hope I live a long time, because I'm going to try to do what I can with that, and I'm inviting everybody else to come along for the ride. You have a comment or a question or something?
Future.
Yes. Well, she's raising, for the tape, she's raising the issue of sacrifice. Now, this is very interesting that you raise this at this point, because it's a key issue that I forgot to bring in. We need to spend a little time before we go, and we'll just stay with it until we stop it in a few minutes. You're absolutely right, sacrifice is a key issue. In fact, we need to realize that the importance of sacrifice in human history may not have just been primitive superstition. In fact, what I've come to realize is that there were always altars in these four quarters, and you sacrificed on the god or goddess that was in charge of that quadrant. You knew sacrifice was necessary. And Bill has been doing some interesting work researching the horse sacrifice, and he and I were talking about this, and I really think that this old image of horses of power, and the idea that there are four great horses of power. If you look at a lot of the images that have been handed down in these cultures, of four great horses pulling a chariot. But Bill has been fascinated, and I would like to get you to comment, Bill, about the importance of the horse sacrifice in these culture, in these Indo-European culture. But the point I want to just raise is, if a horse symbolizes one of these archetypal energies, and if you know that there must be sacrifice involved, we got to think about what's going on there. What is the psychological truth in that? The need to sacrifice. So I want to talk about that in a minute. Can you just comment on the horse sacrifice a little bit?
I'm still working on this, but there's a very ancient Asian Indian Vedic horse sacrifice ceremony where it's an elaborate. It lasts for over a year. A particular favorite stallion is selected. There's a ritual of 3 days where it's blessed, and then basically the stallion is turned free, and there are 100 people that then follow that stallion for the year as it wanders the Indian subcontinent. making sure that it isn't violated or it's not touched, just protecting it. And then at the end of that year, the stallion is brought back to wherever the temple or the city. And then there are a number of ways. Usually it was smothered, but that often there would be a symbolic then mating of the queen with that stallion, now, or the king. There's some variations. The famous horse sacrifice in Rome occurred on October the 15th. There was a chariot race, and the horse that was on the right-hand side of the chariot was then sacrificed. And the head was cut off, and then there was two groups that fought over the head, and depending on which group, it was then put up somewhere. There was a very, apparently fairly bestial Celtic horse sacrifice. So that this theme ranges all the way from India
to the Celts.
The Celtic traditions, which is covered. The Celts were, maybe 500 BC, so you're looking at a range of several thousand years. What really fascinates me is that often, so we were talking yesterday, the goddess that might have been brought into the Indo-European structure, such as Artemis, that Dumezil and Littleton refer to as a trans-functional goddess. The goddess has aspects of royalty, of warrior, and of fertility and cultivator. Typically that goddess was a hippomorphic goddess that the people at the time gave her the qualities or the image of a horse. Athena had, her helmet had a crest of horsehair.
That's right. Athena did have a horse on her helmet.
And so then you had the mating of the king with this hippomorphic goddess representing, which to me is a very symbolic attempt to represent the integration of the royal, the king mating with the hippomorphic goddess representing all three functions.
Yes.
That's where sort of my thinking in terms of horse sacrifice. The horse has always been, in terms of symbolism, nobility, and closely tied to the royalty.
Right.
Just view the statues of Europe.
See, so you...
the warrior, the horse was essential.
Right.
And it's long been a major fertility system.
Right. So the horse, so you got the horse, which carries a sort of a primordial power. Horses have a sense of enormous, to people, if you round horses much, incredible instinctual power. But then your issue of sacrifice, you see, and the idea that they had a sense of this horse sacrifice, and that they smothered, I didn't even get that part. They smothered the horse. Now that's a third function, death. So you look at that, and it's like this energy must come under regulation. It must be, as Freud would say, there must be sublimation. There must be renunciation of an energy before it can be adequately and healthily integrated. So the image of sacrifice has to do with a certain, what I would call, initiatory move into a maturity which can relinquish that energy from the use of narcissistic uses, and then bring it into the larger world-building task, which is when the transformed energy is brought back into the king or the queen. That's the image of bringing that energy back for the use of the king or queen. Remember, the king or queen is the one who's responsible for building the world, making the whole, having a place for people to thrive. So your image of the importance of sacrifice, this is where we're very weak now. We don't get it that sacrifice is necessary if you're to have a world that's habitable. My friends that work in charitable giving, fundraisers and charitable giving, they say we're coming up on a real serious crisis now soon, because what they're noticing is that the people who are now in their 50s, those folks are still substantially supporting, many of them substantially supporting charitable and other kinds of beyond the self causes. What they're noticing, though, is that as you get down in younger age groups, that's dropping off rapidly. And when you put that together with David Gutman's evidence on what happens to narcissism when mentoring processes begin to fall apart, it means that we're in something of a crisis culturally with regard to teaching people the necessity to sacrifice, that there be a world. And, in my King Within book, we talk about the essential tie between real royal energy and sacrifice. That is, true kingship or queenship is servant leadership. It requires sacrifice. So you're making an important point, and it's very clear that people around the world greed has never been stronger than it is now in terms of its global political impact. Elites are having more and more of the resources, financial, economic, and political resources. Elites are now having far more control over the media. And if it were not for the democratic press of the internet and the World Wide Web, there wouldn't be any alternatives to the the consumerization of journalism. So it's a big issue, and so Jung would, for example, Jung would support what you say. He'd say it's very important to look, say, in these biblical traditions, and ask if there may be some stuff that we need to read between the lines about these different images of what sacrifices are worthy and what sacrifices are not, and so on. I mean, it's quite clear that there's a lot of biblical study. Luckily, we've got people like Wayne Rollins and other people who are doing a lot of significant work with biblical traditions through Jungian psychology now. So there are people that are doing that. But you're right. I mean, it's interesting to think about how these narratives image what different sacrifices are for and what they make possible. Other comments? Yes, Sammy.
About the practical implications in terms of research, and in moving to the organized religious community.
Yes.
Critically looking at mythology, and then the psyche, and then the transformation of the individual in order to kind of shore up the survival of the collective of the society
Yes.
of the world.
Yes.
Because churches they have great power, and often it's used to move people, and it is unconsciously done in some instances, consciously in others.
Right.
So it's taking this, for me, on another level would be to look at the relationship of research and practical application.
Yes. Well, and this relates to what we were saying earlier, that not only in educational systems, but in religious, spiritual direction. See, this has enormous implications for spiritual direction and how you even think about what an adequate spirituality would be, whether it's Buddhist or Christian or Jewish or Islamic, because if you look at this stuff, you would have to say that any adequate spirituality would have to really help people access and regulate these energies and bring them into some sort of healthy, creative stewardship for the larger world. Not for the self, and for the larger world. And, we've done some thinking about that, but boy, that's still, you're right, that the larger implications of that are still largely unresearched. And what I keep trying to do is to deal with those people that have not looked at this material or even my structural psychoanalysis very much, and they don't really have a sense of the way this thing works. And for example, I'll have people say, well, this wouldn't apply to this can't be archetypal because it doesn't apply to all human beings. And I say, well, if you can find me a person that doesn't have to deal with their narcissism, doesn't have to deal with their need to integrate their sense of centeredness, doesn't have to deal with the challenges of nurturing, or if you can find me an individual that doesn't have to deal with their aggression, or if you can find me an individual that doesn't have to deal with the material use of their knowledge, development use of knowledge, or if you can find me an individual who does not have to regulate their instinctual life, then I'll say it doesn't apply to everybody. But until such time, I have to be shown that it doesn't, and I have to be shown that this particular theoretical model doesn't fit the data we have. And again, let me just say this again in my view, and let me just summarize then before we stop. In my view, our work in trying to build and develop a scientific Jungian psychoanalysis, there are a number of things that we have to do. We have to work with theory that can be tested. And as I said before, as erudite and brilliant as James Hillman is, he does not have a theory, because he does not show you how any of his assertions could be tested. It's really more like a literary set of aphorisms, and that's valuable. I'm not depreciating the value of aphorisms, but if you have a theory, for example, if someone could prove to me that there are no neurophysiological systems that have to do with aggression, then I would admit I'm wrong. If someone would prove to me there are no neurological systems that have to do with affiliation, then I would say that this theory is wrong. But if you have a theory, it can be tested against cultural evidence and against other sciences. And so that's what I think is that we have to do. That's what Jung tried to do. I mean, that is what Jung's project was. He was one of the first to do empirical psychological testing. And I believe we can come up with empirical tests that test these materials. Some people are already working on it. So what we have to do is if we're going to continue a Jungian research tradition, is to ask Jungian questions of cultural materials. And when there are enormous amounts of cultural materials that have not been so utilized, then we need to try to get more work done to draw upon those cultural resources. So in short, and we'll close with this, I'm very indebted to those folks that pointed out Dumezil's work and the new comparative mythology to me, particularly indebted to Scott Littleton and Dean Miller for giving me an introduction. And I am deeply indebted to each of you for being willing to come out and kick these ideas around with me to reflect upon the promise of this new body of evidence for Jungians, I think, relatively new body of evidence for Jungians, in carrying forward our Jungian research project. So again, thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I'll stick around a few minutes to chat with you. Thank you.